Hello, so this is the second part of digestion. So last time we talked about digestion and we made it down through the stomach. So we're going to pick up here with the small intestine and finish up. So let's review just a little bit. So if you remember when we were talking about before, we talked about how that we had two parts. We had the GI tract, which is this long tube. Remember, it's open on both ends, and this GI tract is pretty much the same all the way through. It has layers to it, and remember there was an inner layer called the mucosa, and then there's a layer called the submucosa, and then we have the muscularis externa, and then finally the serosa. And if you remember when we looked at it in the esophagus. We also looked at it in the stomach. And so what we're going to do is we're going to continue on with this. Also remember though, there's another part to the digestive system, and these are the accessory structures. And so if you look at accessory structures, these are things like teeth and salivary glands and stuff like that. And so we're going to talk about those toward the end. But we're going to start with the small intestine. So here's the small intestine. So up here is the stomach. And so if you look at the stomach, remember it looks a little bit like this. It's sort of J-shaped. And then down here at the very bottom, there's this pyloric sphincter. And that pyloric sphincter is going to control the movement of materials from the stomach into the small intestine. It's a sphincter. Remember, sphincters are circular muscles that are controlling movement of materials through a tube. And so that's the pyloric sphincter, and right here it is. So as the stomach digests the food, it turns into this sort of almost milky-like consistency of this material, which is called chyme. And what's going to happen is periodically the muscle's going to contract. The stomach muscularis externa is going to contract, and at the same time, this pyloric sphincter is going to relax. And so fluid is going to get pushed through here, this chyme, a little bit at a time. So, if we look at the small intestine, it's called small because it's narrow. It's small in diameter. It's not called that because it's short, because it's not. It's actually very long. If you look at it in an adult, in a living person, it's about 15 feet long. It's about the size of an adult jump rope. But if you look at it in a cadaver, it's longer. In a cadaver, it's about 20 feet. And the reason why it's different is because in a living person, there's always some partial contraction, and we call that tone. But when you die, you lose the tone, and so the muscle relaxes, and so the tube gets longer. But here is this tube. So it starts right here, and look at it. It goes this way, and it twists, and it turns, and so on, and goes all the way to right here. Right here is another sphincter. Now, it's not called the sphincter. It's called the ileocecal valve. But that's the end of the small intestine. So it begins and ends in a sphincter. Here's this pyloric sphincter, and there is the ileocecal valve. Well, when you look at it, it's got regions to it. There are 3 regions. The first one is this one, and it's about 1 foot long. This one's called the duodenum, or sometimes the duodenum, and it's about 1 foot in length. The second part is this one here, and this is called the jejunum, and the jejunum is about 6 feet long. That's this one. And then the last part is this one right here, and this is called the ileum. Well, notice that ileum here is spelt differently than ileum when we're talking about bones. Ileum, when we're talking about bones, is I-L-I-U-M. When you're talking about the small intestine, it's I-L-E-U-M. But they sound exactly the same. But the ileum is the longest part. It's about 8 feet. So if you add that up, then you get about 15 feet. Well, here's a model that sort of shows the same thing. So here's the small intestine. Here's another model basically showing the same thing. This is the one we saw in the beginning. So right here is where that pyloric sphincter is. So that's the pyloric sphincter right there. And if you follow it to the end, right here is this ileocecal valve. And then again, remember, we have these 3 sections. Well, it's a little bit hard to see on this model, but I know this is the first section, so I know this is the duodenum. And then I know this is the last section, so I know this is the ileum. And so somewhere in here, I don't know exactly where, but that's the duodenum. Well, the small intestine is where most digestion takes place. It's also where most absorption takes place. So if we were to look inside this here, we're going to see that it looks very, very different than most things. Here it is. Here's our duodenum. And if you look in here, look, there are these ridges. Well, they're not actually ridges. They're more like this. They're these circular folds that run all the way down this duodenum. And what they're there for is to increase the surface area. Because not only does digestion happen in here, so does absorption. And absorption has to take place across a membrane. And so the more membrane, the more surface you have, the more absorption you could do. So look, if I had just a flat membrane in this space, yes, I can absorb. I can absorb here and here and here and here and here, but that's it, because when you run out of space, you can't absorb anymore. But if I take that membrane and I fold it up like this, well, in the same distance, I can get a whole lot more membrane. And that's exactly what these folds are all about. And so when you look at them, they increase the surface area. And so they increase the capacity for absorption. Not only does absorption take place, but so does digestion. And the main organ associated with digestion here is the pancreas. Now the liver is also involved. You can see this little green tube, that's coming down from the liver. Well, if you look, the pancreas empties right here into the small intestine, and this empties right here into the small intestine. And so these products that come from the liver and the pancreas are the ones that are going to do the digestion. So the small intestine is a location, it's a place for digestion to happen. But the digestive system products are made by the pancreas and the liver, and we'll talk about those later on. If you look at this picture, you can see exactly where those products come out. So here's where they come out from the pancreas. There are 2 ducts that empty into the small intestine. And here's coming down from the liver. And so there's a bigger duct that carries in materials down that way. And right here is where they empty into the small intestine. So remember, what we have are these circular folds. They look a little bit like a slinky, if you know what a slinky is, or they look like a spring and it runs through here. Well, sometimes they're just called circular folds, but usually they're called plicae circulares. Well, if I look on the plica here, I'm actually going to see something else that helps to increase the surface area. And if I blow it up, this is what the plica looks like. And so it's one of those folds. Well, if I blow that up even more, look, it's got these bumps all over it. These bumps are actually finger-like projections that are called villi. And so remember we said it looks like this, but in reality now there are these little bumps that stick out right here and make it even more surface area. And so we have even a ton more surface area because we have these villi. Well, if I took a villus and blew it up, it would look like this. So this is just one of these little bumpy things blown up. Well, there's even more to make the surface area go up because the cells of this villus, these are simple columnar cells. You can even see goblets here because there's a lot of mucus production. But remember, simple columnar, if you look at it, they're tall, skinny cells. And some of these, remember, have cilia, but a lot of them have folded up membrane up here. And that's exactly what you see right there. The tops of these cells are folded up. And so we get even smaller villi called microvilli. So there are these three things that are going to increase the surface area inside the small intestine. The plici circulares, the villi, villus is singular, and microvilli. And so we're going to have tons of surface area. And so we can do tons of absorption. Well, here's another model showing that same thing. This is the model that we saw in the first part. And if you remember, this is the mucosa layer right here. Well, this actually is the small intestine. That's what this model is from. And if you look at it, you can see these are villi. So that's a villus. That's a villus. And if you look here at the tops of the cells, that's where we would see the microvilli. So these are those simple columnar cells. These blue dots are the goblet cells that are making the mucus. And so what is going to happen here is across this surface area, we're going to absorb all kinds of materials. We're going to absorb things, glucose and amino acids and vitamins and fatty acids and all sorts of things. And then they're going to go into these structures here to be transported to the liver. And they're going to the liver because the liver gets first chance at everything that comes out of the small intestine because the liver has a ton of jobs. We'll talk about that more when we get to the liver, but that's the first place it's going to go, is to the liver. So if we look at that, what we see are, there's our epithelium. Remember, we got these microvilli here. And so this is where we're going to get this absorption. And depending on what the material is, it's either going to go into a blood capillary or it's going to go into a lymphatic capillary, which in the digestive system, lymphatic capillaries are called lacteals. So different materials go into different parts. If you talk about things like glucose, amino acids, things like that, even small peptides, vitamins, those things go into the blood capillaries. So they go into the blood capillaries, and then the blood capillaries, that blood's going to go, and again, it's going to go to the liver. But if you're talking about fat does not get transported through the blood. It gets transported by way of the lymph. So it's going to go in here. And then again, it's also going to go to the liver. Another thing you can see in this picture is a Peyer's patch. So if you remember when we talked about the lymphatic system, we said that in the small intestine, especially in the ileum, there is a bunch of these sort of like tonsil structures, Peyer's patches. And remember, these are lymphoid tissues. Lymphoid tissues are those tissues that have high numbers of white blood cells. Because not only is there food and liquid out here, but there's also bacteria out here. And so the white blood cells in this Peyer's patch can fight off those bacteria and keep them from getting into the body. So that's what the small intestine looks like. Again, remember that the ends of the small intestine, there's two sphincters. We have this one up here, that's the pyloric. And then we have another one down here, which is called the ileocecal valve. Well, what happens is as you move through here, we're going to do digestion and we're going to do absorption. And so lots and lots and lots of materials are going to get moved out of here, moved out. And they're going to go to the liver. All sorts of things, glucose, amino acids, all those things. Fat also, remember, but it's going to go by way of the lymphatic system. So what you're going to be left with when you get to this distal end right here is basically a bunch of waste products. It's also going to be cellulose. Cellulose is what makes up plant cell walls. And so if you eat a plant, you're eating these cells that have cellulose cell walls. And those cell walls in humans are pretty much indigestible. So they're going to wind up in here. There's also going to be a whole lot of water that winds up in here. So it's going to be waste, it's going to be water, it's going to be cellulose. It could also be some cell products or cell debris. But that's what's going to wind up coming through this ileocecal valve. And where it's going to go is into the large intestine. So if you look at the large intestine, it's large in diameter. That's why it's called large. It's large in diameter. Here is our ileocecal valve right here. So this is where the material is going to come into the large intestine. Again, it's a whole lot of water, but it's also wastes that we can't digest, indigestible stuff like cellulose, fiber, that sort of stuff. That's what's going to come in here. So let's talk about the large intestine. So if you look at the large intestine, it has regions to it, just like the small intestine. The first region is right here. It's below, it's inferior to this ileocecal valve. And that region is called the cecum. It's a little short pouch-like structure, not very big in humans. And then we have this part here. In this part, the materials are going up. So this is called the ascending colon. And then we have this part here, where it crosses the body in a transverse manner. So it's called the transverse colon. And then there's this part here, where now the materials are moving down. And so that's called the descending colon. And then there's an S shape right here. And this S shape is the sigmoid colon. And then finally there's a straight section. And the word for straight is rectus. So this is called the rectum. And then the very last part is there's an anal canal and then the anus. So those are the regions. So let's talk about these regions. Here's another picture of it. We can see those same things. So there's our cecum. There's our ascending, there's our transverse, there's our descending. Now this one you can't really see the sigmoid, it's hidden, but it would be right here. And then here's the rectum, here's the anal canal, and there's the anus. Let's look at this cecum. So here's the cecum. Humans have a very short cecum. That's not true for all animals. If you look at something like a horse, which eats a lot of grass or hay, or a rabbit, which also eats stuff like that, or a koala bear, which eats a lot of leaves, they have a very, very large colon, a long colon, cecum. And if you look at it in a koala bear, it's actually spiral. It's a long spiral cecum that looks like this. The reason these animals have such a large cecum is because the cecum is where cellulose digestion takes place. So look, these animals eat a lot of plant material. And remember, plants have this cellulose as part of their cell wall. So they can digest cellulose very, very well. But humans have this very short cecum. And so our cellulose digestion is very low. Now there's a tiny bit of it, but not very much. A good way to illustrate this is to think about what happens if you eat a kernel of corn. So if you eat a whole kernel of corn, it has a case of cellulose around it. And we cannot digest that cellulose. And so it's going to protect the stuff that's on the inside. And that kernel of corn is going to go through here, it's going to go through here, it's going to go through here, and it's going to come out looking almost exactly the way it did when it went in. It's still going to be this whole kernel of corn. And the reason we cannot digest it is because of this cellulose layer. If you want to eat corn and want to get any value out of it, we have to break this layer. So we have to chew it, or we have to grind it, something like that, so that the inside material comes out. Now the inside we can digest just fine. That's called endosperm. So there's the cecum. Now if you notice, the cecum has attached to it the appendix, and we've talked about the appendix already when we talked about the lymphatic system. So just like we said a minute ago about those Peyer's patches, the appendix is lymphoid tissue, and lymphoid tissue has high numbers of white blood cells. And so white blood cells come into contact with the material that's in the cecum. Then the material moves this way. And so what happens here, there's not much digestion that goes on here by us, but there's a ton of bacteria in our large intestine. And so we're going to get bacterial digestion. So the foodstuffs that made it in here and they weren't digested, bacteria will have a chance to do that. And so as it moves through here, bacteria will feed on this material. And what will happen to some of it is we'll steal it. So we steal things like vitamins and some other things from those bacteria. If you eat beans, beans have a sugar in them that we cannot digest. So it goes all the way through. And when that sugar gets in here, though, the bacteria can digest that sugar very easily. It's a 7-carbon sugar called a heptose. And those bacteria will digest this like crazy. And one of the byproducts of them digesting it is gas. And that's why we get flatulence if we eat beans. Now, you could take an enzyme that gets rid of this cellular or heptose before it enters the large intestine, and you don't get gas, or at least not as much. So you probably heard of Bino. Bino is just an enzyme that breaks down this sugar. As you continue to move through here, we're going to pull out water. And so water is going to be removed. And so by the time you get over here, there's very little water left. So we're going to take out like vitamins, we're going to steal stuff from the bacteria, we're going to take out the water, and what's going to happen is we're going to produce something called feces. And feces is just left over. Anything that we cannot digest becomes feces. And eventually we're going to remove those feces in a process called defecation or defecation. Let's look at the anatomy of the large intestine. So it's got some unique features. One thing is it has bends to it. So there's a bend right there, and there's another one right there. They're called flexures. So there's a right colic flexure and a left colic flexure. Another thing that's kind of unique to it is it looks like it has pouches. So these pouch-like structures are called haustra. So an individual one is called a haustrum. But look, haustra. And what causes these haustra to form is that when you look at this tube, remember we've got those layers. We have the mucosa, and we have the submucosa. We have this muscularis externa. Well, remember the muscularis externa has layers to it. We saw in the stomach that there were 3 layers, but everywhere else there's only 2. There's a circular and a longitudinal. Well, that's the same thing that's true here. But the longitudinal layer is only in these little tiny bands. So you can see these bands right here. There are 3 of these. These bands are just the reduced longitudinal layer of the muscle. Well, they have their own name. They're called tinea coli. So the tinea coli are the longitudinal layer of the muscularis externa. And they tense, or they have tone to them. And what they do is they pull puckers into the large intestine. And again, those are called haustra. Well, if we follow this large intestine all the way to the end, we get to the rectum. So here's the rectum. Now this is a different model, but this is the pelvis. Actually, this is a female. But you can see the rectum right here. And right there is the anus. So right here is the anal canal. Now if you look on this side, it's opened up. So there's the rectum. Here's the anal canal right here, and there's the anus. Well, we want to be able to control the movement of the feces outside, and so there are 2 more sphincters here. There's one on the outside that's made out of skeletal muscle. And remember, skeletal muscle's voluntary. So it's called the external anal sphincter. You can see it right here. This is it. Over here, this is the external sphincter. Remember, this has been cut, so it's a circle that goes all the way around. But that's it right there. Again, it's voluntary. But there's also a sphincter on the inside. We can't see it over here, but it's in there. On this side, you can see it. That's it right there. And that's it right there. And again, remember, it goes all the way around. This is the internal anal sphincter. This is smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle is involuntary. And so we don't have any voluntary control over that sphincter. If we blow that up, we can see those sphincters here. So here's the anus, there's the anal canal, here is the external sphincter, and here's the internal sphincter. Again, external is skeletal muscle and voluntary. Internal is smooth muscle and involuntary. So that's the GI tract. But remember, not only do we have the GI tract, we also have these accessory structures. And so we're going to look at these accessory structures. And the first one we're going to look at are the teeth. So let's look at teeth. So here's a full set of adult teeth. And if I count those adult teeth, I have 32 adult teeth. But look at them, they don't all look the same. We come over here, here's another model, and here they are here as well. Here's the top, and there's the bottom. And look, those teeth look different than these teeth, which look different than these and these. So there are 4 different types of teeth. We have these teeth which look a lot like blades. They look like blades, and they're for cutting. We have these teeth which look like daggers, and they're for stabbing. And then if you look at these teeth and these teeth, they have grinding surfaces on them, and so they're for grinding materials. And so when you eat different foods, you use these different teeth to cut it up or grind it down and so on. Well, each of these types of teeth have their own name. We have incisors. So the incisors are the ones that look like knives, or they look like blades. And there's 4 of them. 2 on each side. On the top, same thing on the bottom. 4, 2 on each side. And then right next to them are those that look like blades, and these are called canines. Canines. And there's only 1 of these on each side, top and bottom. And then next to that, we have the premolars, which are sometimes called bicuspids. But there's 2 of these. So here are the premolars, top and bottom on each side. And then finally, we have the molars. And there are 3 of these, top and bottom on both sides. So if we add up all of those, we get 32. We can also just talk about how many there are of each one. So remember, we had 2 incisors, top and bottom, both sides. 1 canine, top and bottom, both sides. 2 premolars and 3 molars. And that gives us what's called the dental formula. So the dental formula for adult humans is 2, 1, 2, 3. Top, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bottom, both sides. And if we multiply that out, if we add it up, it's 32. But if we look at children, Children have different teeth. So humans have two sets of teeth. Our first set is either called primary or baby teeth, or sometimes milk teeth, or even deciduous teeth. But if you look at these teeth, we don't have the same number. And if you look at their dentition is 2102. Top and bottom, both sides. And if I multiply that out, I get 20. So not 32. So little kids only have 20 teeth. And look, they have no premolars. And instead of having 3 molars, they only have 2. But no matter which tooth you're looking at, they have pretty much the same structure. And if we look at this picture, we can see this white part, and then we can see this part. And that's true for all of this. Well, the white is enamel. And the part of the tooth that's covered in enamel is called the crown. This yellow that we saw here is called cementum. And the part of the tooth that's covered in cementum is the root. So we have a crown and we have a root. And between the two, we have the neck. So if we look at it, there's our crown, there's our root, there's the neck. We also have layers. So if we look at it, we can see layers. There's the enamel we were talking about. Enamel is the hardest substance in your body. This is the only place you find it. And then underneath that, we have something that's very similar to bone. It's called dentin. And then if you go deeper than that, there's this area that's full of soft tissue. It's got blood vessels and nerves in it. It's called the pulp cavity. Well, those blood vessels and nerves have to get in there some way, and so they travel through the root. And they have a canal where they travel through. So they have a root canal. Right here at the very beginning where they enter the root is called the apical foramen. And then if you look here, that's the cementum that we were talking about. That's what gives it that yellowish color. And the cementum helps to hold the tooth in place. So there's a ligament that holds the tooth to the bone. And that ligament is called the periodontal ligament. Is attached to that cementum, and then it's attached to the bone. And so it holds the tooth in its socket. So layers again. There's our 3 layers. We come down here. We can see the root canal. There's that cementum. We also have gums around our teeth. That's called gingiva. There's that apical foramen where the blood vessels enter and go through the root canal. And then here you can see this periodontal ligament. Again, that's what holds it in place. It's fibers. It's just like a ligament. And it attaches this cementum to the bone. Another accessory gland is the structure is the salivary glands. And there are 3 pairs of salivary glands. So there's a large pair near the ears. Those are called parotids. A pretty large pair underneath near the mandible. Those are the submandibular. And then there's smaller ones under the tongue, and these are called sublinguals. They all make saliva. And saliva is actually a really important material. One thing it does is it lubricates the food. and so it makes the food easier to swallow. But it also cleanses your mouth. It's constantly being secreted, and so we're constantly washing the surfaces of our mouth and our teeth. So it cleanses it. If you look at the models, there's our parotids, there's our submandibulars, and there's the sublinguals. Another one is the liver. So if you look at the liver, when we look at this picture, you can see a bunch of little vessels. Well, there are 3 different types of vessels here. Actually 4, sort of. The red ones are arteries. We know what arteries are. The blue ones are veins. And the purple ones are a special type of vein called portal veins. But they're also veins. And then finally, these green ones are bile ducts. So if you look at the liver, it's a large organ. It's actually just a gland. It's a huge gland. It's the largest one in your body. And it has lobes to it. There are 4 lobes. So there's a right lobe, which is the biggest one. There's a left lobe, which is the second biggest one. And then there are 2 smaller lobes, and they're easier to see from the inferior side, from the bottom. The easiest way to find these is to find 2 other things first. One is to find the gallbladder. It's green and it's fairly large, so it's easy to see. And there's a lobe right next to it, and this lobe is pretty square, so it's called the quadrate lobe. And then this is the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava, huge nerve. And right next to it is the 4th lobe. And this lobe is supposed to look something like a tail. So it's called the caudate lobe. So 4 lobes, right lobe, left lobe, quadrate lobe, caudate lobe. Again, if we look under here, we can see arteries. So there's the hepatic artery right there, the large artery going to the liver. And then it divides and divides and divides. We have veins, and so we have these hepatic veins. Those are the blue ones. But we also have these that are colored purple, and those are called hepatic portal veins. And the portal system connects the small intestine directly to the liver. So remember we said that when you absorb things, they go to the liver first. That's the portal system that connects the small intestine directly to the liver. And then these green things, remember, are bile ducts. So if you look at bile ducts, the liver has over 100 different functions. So it stores things, it makes things. We talked about clotting factors, it makes those. It can convert one thing to another. It can store glucose, release glucose, make all kinds of proteins. 100 different functions. But for digestion, the most important thing is it also makes bile. So bile is made in these cells out here. And then the bile goes through these little tiny ducts, and the ducts merge, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so when we look at these ducts, you can see them out here, these little tiny things. And they're going to get bigger. Eventually, they're going to form two pretty large ducts. And here are these ducts, right? Here's one, and here's another one. This one is coming from the left lobe, so it's called the left hepatic duct. And this one's coming from the right lobe, so it's called the right hepatic duct. And the two of those are going to merge to form this duct right here. And this duct is called the common hepatic duct. Well, we make bile all the time, but we don't eat constantly. So if you haven't had a meal, what happens is the bile will go into this organ and be stored here. Well, bile is green in color, and so this organ is green in color, and that's the gallbladder. And then when you do eat a meal, the gallbladder is going to contract and force the bile this way. And so we have another two more ducts. We have this one, which is called cystic duct, and this one, which is called the common bile duct. So we have these ducts. Here's another picture showing these ducts. So there's the right hepatic. There's the left hepatic. There's the common hepatic. There's the cystic. And then there's the common bile duct. And what's going to happen is that bile is going to go into the small intestine, just like we saw before. So here's our liver. There's the lobes. You can see all four of them. The right lobe is the biggest. Left lobe is the next biggest. There's our quadrate next to the gallbladder. There's our caudate next to the inferior vena cava. Another thing is the liver is suspended. And we talked about this in the first video. But the digestive system is suspended. Remember, we had this mesenteries, and we named some of those mesenteries. Remember, there was the greater omentum, the lesser omentum, the transverse mesocolon. Well, here's another mesentery. It's the one that holds the liver, and it's called the falciform ligament. So the falciform ligament suspends this liver and holds it in place. You can see it from both sides. So if we turn it over, you can see it as well. So you can also see it here. And so the diaphragm is up here. And this is attached to the diaphragm and holds it in place. Remember, this is a mesentery, which is a double layer of visceral peritoneum, just like what we talked about before. And so it keeps the liver from falling down to the bottom of the abdominal cavity. You can also see it on this picture, although not as well. If we blow it up a little bit, though, you can still see the picture. There's one more ligament as well. And this ligament is right here. It's this white ligament. It's called the round ligament. And the round ligament is actually a leftover from your umbilical cord. So the umbilical vein goes to the liver. And when you're born, it turns into this ligament. You can see it here as well. And you can see it here as well. And then you can also see it here. So that's the round ligament. And here it is right here. Okay, so, and then let's look at the gallbladder. So here's the gallbladder. The gallbladder is basically just a storage organ, and it stores bile. And so when we're not eating, we're still going to make bile. What's going to happen is it's going to go into the tubes and it's going to go this way, and it gets stored there. The gallbladder also removes excess water, so it concentrates it too. Now, sometimes bile can crystallize. Bile has a lot of cholesterol in it, and it can crystallize. So those cholesterol crystals can form bile or gallstones. And gallstones can block these ducts. And when they block these ducts, you get loss of function. You also get inflammation. You get a lot of pain. And the only way to fix this is to get rid of those gallstones. And a lot of times what they do is actually just remove the gallbladder. Well, you don't stop making bile, because remember, it's not the gallbladder that makes bile, it's the liver that makes bile. But there's no storage organ. And so there's no place where there's a lot of bile at once. So someone who has had gallbladder surgery, they have to eat small meals. And they have to watch their fat intake, because the function of bile is to emulsify fat. And it allows fat to be digested. So here's a blow up of that, and you can see the gallbladder and the cystic duct. You can also see these other ducts in here. So that's the cystic duct. There's the right lymphatic and the left lymphatic and the common, and so on. Another organ that is an accessory structure and is also very important is this pancreas. And I talked a little bit about it before. But if you look at the pancreas, it's got a head, it's got a body, it's got a tail. It also has a whole bunch of little tiny lobes, and those are called lobules. So here's a lobule, a lobule, a lobule, and so on. And there's a little duct that comes out of each one of these lobules. And so the pancreas makes lots of different things. In fact, when we did endocrine, remember we talked about that it makes insulin and it makes glucagon, those hormones. Well, those are important, but it also makes a ton of digestive enzymes. And without these digestive enzymes, you cannot digest food. And so you cannot live without your pancreas, because these digestive enzymes help you digest proteins and fats and carbohydrates, all of those things. And so without these, you can't digest any food at all. So these digestive enzymes are produced in these little lobules, and then they travel through these ducts. And if you look at this, it's sort of like a fish skeleton. And there's two ducts here. There's one big one. That one's called the pancreatic duct. And then over here is a little bitty branch that comes off. That's called the accessory duct. And they're going to empty into this small intestine. In this picture, you can also see the common bile duct. There it is right there. So the common bile duct is coming down from the liver. And the pancreatic duct is coming from the pancreas, and they both empty right here. There's our pancreatic duct right here. And here is that common bile duct, which is coming down from here. And it empties right in there. So that's the end of the part 2 of the digestion. So thank you for coming, and don't forget to watch part 1 before you do part 2.